For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So he's already talked about like the ethics of karma. And that then comes the, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the great plank in your own eye? This is his humour coming through again. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then, you'll be able to help your brother. So, there's a lot of depths and nuances to these texts, which in Greek it's really fascinating to look. And I think a lot of this was given in Greek and Aramaic, but they spoke Greek, these disciples, as did Matthew, because they were dealing in a Hellenistic cultural context. They'd been speaking Greek for generations. And the word, by the way, for a disciple is a mathematician. The technical term in Greek for disciple of Jesus was a mathesis, which simply meant a student, a learned person. And that's the origin of our word mathematics. It's interesting. Jesus is talking about divine mathematics, effectively. Okay, let's move on and look at the periodic table, shall we? There's a lot to choose from, but I'm sure you'll think of something.
Yes, because on the prayer we spoke about people who converted from Hinduism to Buddhism.
Yeah.
So it raised my curiosity about Hinduism.
Okay.
There is so many of them, I don't know which one to choose. Maybe the classic one. Which one is the oldest? The origin of Hinduism?
Well, I suppose that would be Vedic. That would be
Vedic,
61. Yeah. Okay, well, we can have that one. Yeah, which one are you going to have, madam?
I'm going to choose, unless you've had it recently, but I was interested, it's a little bit related, Jainism.
Yeah, we haven't had that for a
You
while.
haven't? Okay.
Which one of the two do you want?
Yeah, I don't know, you can choose. I don't know the
Okay,
differences.
well, we did have Digambara a while back, so let's have Svetabara, 89. Okay, so those are good. So let's do the Hindu one first, 61. Vedic tradition is, another name for this is Sanatan Dharma, which means eternal truth. And the word Hinduism wasn't used all this time. It was a word much later coined by the British to try and give a name to their faith. And it was taken from the Persian word for the river, their name, Hindustan, because the Persians conquered it under the Mughal dynasty. And, but they themselves referred to themselves as followers of Sanatan Dharma, the eternal truth. How old is it? Well, that's an interesting question. The actual Vedic texts, according to historical scholarship, date back to the origins of the Sanskrit language, because they're in Sanskrit. And that was being spoken at least by about 1500 BC. They were not written down at that time, because the Sanskrit didn't have an alphabet. The alphabet came later, about 500 BC or so. But it was orally transmitted. And these were seers who were visionaries, and they were, in sort of trance states of ecstasy, downloading the wisdom of the gods, is a simple way of putting it. Up in the northern part of India, in the Himalayas, they came to that part of the world from at least about 1500 BC, probably earlier. And those Vedas are hymns. The Rig Veda is the most religious. It tells the story of creation, which basically begins as a thought in the mind of Brahma, the creator. And the chief deity in that era was Indra, Indra is the god of the first Vedic followers, who is the lord of the thunderbolt. The thunderbolt is his, his calling card. When it's thunder and lightning, that's Indra. And you can imagine, I've never seen a thunderstorm in the Himalayas, but you can imagine it must be pretty extraordinary. And that's God doing his thing. I think it's the same route as Taranis here in Gaul. The Druid Celts worshipped the god of thunder, Taranis. And in Scandinavia, where our friend Inga Meta came from, it's Thor. So they're fascinating, those hymns of creation. They also worshipped fire, Agni, who's a very important deity. And then so by about 800 BC, the Vedic culture was developed very sophisticated intellectual thought about these Vedic texts. So it was different to the idea of like the Bible, which just recounts a story, a narrative of how God creates everything, and you're not allowed to question it or discuss it. It's just given. And the prophet Moses and the others, they're just quite absolutist in their views. If you question them, you get burned up by God's, intervention, hence the killings in the Bible. There's nothing like that in Hinduism. And the students were encouraged to discuss with the teachers, and it was passed down orally. And then you have these other texts called the Upanishads appearing. And the Upanishads are a very advanced philosophical text very early on, based on commentaries on the Vedic texts. And they're discussions between a guru, rishi they're called, and students. And they're discussing questions like, what is consciousness? Where does it live? What happens to it after death? What's it made of? Where does mind come from? How is it... If we reincarnate again and again, where do we go in between lives? All these really profound discussions are happening about 800 BC. Another thing we know the Vedic culture was into is what they call soma, which was a psychedelic herb they grew, and obviously triggered some of their visions and downloads. There's a lot of discussion among scholars, was that a form of cannabis which grew and was used and worshipped, or was it something else? There's no absolute agreement on that. It may well have been cannabis, but they made it into like a drink, which they still do in India. They call it bang, and there's one day a year when everyone in India is allowed to get stoned by drinking this stuff. And it's sacred to Shiva, who is a kind of Vedic sage incarnated, but is the eternal, omniscient, divine consciousness behind the universe, taking form as Shiva. And there are Shiva Sutras being developed, and yogic practices are coming into being, which is how you can contact the supreme consciousness. And you can do it with bang, or you can do it with yogic breathing, or you can do it with prayer, intense devotion. All these things are flourishing in the Vedic schools, and they still are. So nowadays you've got rishis in India. Rishikesh is one of the centres, but this great festival, I think it's going on still, which my friend Satyan Raja has been to. He's a kind of latter-day sage who has gone to the Kumbh Mela, which is the biggest gathering of sages on the planet. It happens once every 4 years. It's happening now in northern India. He's gone to it from Canada. And I think about 4 or 5 million sages, most of them semi-naked, long grey beards and with their Shiva staff and, the whole McCoy. They come down from the Himalayas. It's an extraordinary event. And they go to one of these sacred sites. I think there's 4, and they meet in different ones every 4 years. And the thinking behind it is that in the beginning of time, when the world had just been created, there was a conflict between different types of gods, the Asuras, they're called, and the Vedic gods, and they were fighting in the heaven worlds. And nectar was created, which is the food of the gods. It's like a magic potion. And somebody had it in a conch and was flying across India with it, but a few drops dropped out. And where it dropped is where they have the Kumbh Mela, because tradition knows where the drop fell. And that was magic potion from the gods. So it's a great story, you know, and that's why they're still there doing their thing. So that's the Vedic tradition. And my friend Professor Gavin Flood, who taught as head of Hindu studies at the University of Oxford, has written about it in detail. He felt, and I think he's right, that when Buddha was growing up in that region, he would have been brought up in this tradition of Indra. And when I went to visit the homeland of Buddha and went to, you know, where he was from, near Patna, I went to Nalanda University, which is in ruins, but it was the greatest Buddhist university. I went to the museum. All the statues from that time in early Buddhism were all of Indra-related things. And when Buddha taught, he always he talked of Indra. Indra's paradise is heaven. When this kind of Buddhism was taken to Tibet, they used the thunderbolt as their symbolic weapon of enlightenment. So I have one here, bronze Vajra, they're called, which is the thunderbolt. And that's, so I think, yes. And the other thing, Buddha was brought up in a place called Kapilavastu, which is named after Kapila, who was one of the founders of a particular, the most important form of yoga, Samkhya Yoga. And Kapila was a great sage living at this Vedic time, 800 BC. And Buddha, and the city Buddha was going to be prince of was called Kapilavastu after him. So young Gautama Buddha would have known all this stuff I'm talking about. His position was that, well, okay, we want to get there now. I'm impatient. What is enlightenment? I don't want to just read books about Indra's thunderbolt. I want it in my consciousness now. How do I get that? Anyway, lots of food for thought. Any comments or questions on that one? My only comment would be that much as I love the Hindu tradition and the Vedic tradition, I don't think it should declare war on the Islamic traditions of India, or the Christian, or the others. I think, as scholars, we should work out how the stories of the Indian gods and the Islamic god and the Jewish and the Christian gods can be harmonized and synthesized. If you look at this historically, using critical scholarship and historical stuff, it's possible. And you know, people like Nehru and Gandhi and the great Indian sages, Aurobindo, they were trying to do that. They certainly weren't trying to create a sort of Hindu nationalism that would claim India just for them. And in fact, the Vedas and the Upanishads, they teach humility, because God is in everything and in each human heart. The Atman lives in all of us. And whatever, you know, it lived in Muhammad, it lived in Khadijah, it lived in Moses, it lived in Jesus. So there should be no quarrel here. And I believe in what I call meta-Hinduism. We should reclaim that knowledge for the whole universal humanity. Anyway, that's my little comment.
May I say something?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
What I found very interesting in Pierre Leroux book
Yes.
You borrowed me is well conscious about the dilemma between individualism, which is very close to the Christianism, that
Yeah.
this we came from that civilization, and also with the Greek philosophy, but with Christianism the individual is autonomous somewhere and is a king of himself. But as far as, and he says socialism We of course live in a group, in a village, in a country, so we have not to go further or individualism because we live together. But for him it was very important not to forget individualism and became a totalitarian state
Right.
that dictates the law for everybody.
Yeah.
He was against that.
Sure, he didn't like Marx's
No,
theories.
no.
He'd be absolutely,
And he said also.
can't force socialism on people.
Yeah, after the French Revolution, the guy was saying we want freedom and we want equality, and he said, "You are missing something. Fraternity is also important." And
He talks about that.
yeah. There are very nice writings about that,
Yeah.
because he's aware of mankind imperfection. And he say we make mistakes.
Sure.
Okay, we take care of that because of fraternity. It's not.
Yeah.
We are not purely communist, but we are not purely Christians, because the problem of some people who claim to be themselves purely Christians, they are only on spiritual level and trying to be perfect, and that's a problem because
We're also pagan in our
Yeah.
humanity.
Yeah.
We're made of the earth. We breathe thanks to the trees. So I
And-
think he says that, doesn't he? I mean, he
Yeah,
talks
yeah.
about paganism as a root, I think.
I didn't dig enough.
Okay.
And so my
I'm going to
question.
work on it.
So my question is now, considering the problem between Hinduism and Islam, isn't it difficult for us to think about that, because we think as Occidental people with individualism, but for these people, if Hinduism has recommendation for communities, a way of living, and also Islam has some condition for communities, a way to live,
Yeah.
maybe there are some trouble. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. There are troubles, as there are between all the kind of revealed traditions that get stuck in their own legalisms. That was the problem Jesus had, trying to update Judaism, because the legal professors said, no, you can't do that. You can't heal people on a Sabbath. And so my solution to this, which is quite radical, is that we have to elevate human consciousness back to the level of enlightenment, which the original sages, founding sages of all these lineages had. We have to get us, everybody, back to the insight that these Vedic sages had, for instance, and their equanimity, their enlightenment, right? And it's a project I'm working on, which is this idea of complete universal enlightenment to parallel complete universal disarmament. We're not going to get one without the other. And if we get complete enlightenment, you see, I argue, you can be completely enlightened and stay a Muslim. You can be completely enlightened and stay a Hindu. Completely enlightened and stay a Christian. And that is the answer to the world's current problems, because the point I'm working on is what would that look like? What would the world look like if I could wave a magic wand? Let's say I was the greatest rishi of all history and had a wand, and I could wave a magic wand, everybody suddenly reaches enlightenment. What would it look like? That's what I'm trying to think, and I think it's possible. And it's a big ask, I know, but it's either that or it's absolute destruction. It seems to me. I don't see.
No, I think there is an in between. It's very interesting. We speak about Pierre Leroux because we have to deal with the human imperfection. So it came with the I don't remember her name.
About
no, not that. Philosophical politics, and because to organize the society we have to make politics, and we have
Yeah.
to get the wisdom from philosophy, and that's
Do you mean our Finnish friend who was here?
yeah, no,
What's
no,
the
no,
club?
the Irish one, Russian,
Oh, Roshin, yes,
yes,
the
Russian,
yeah, the philosophy graduate.
yes,
Roshin.
yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. She was good on political philosophy. Yeah, yeah. Of course, that's a huge issue. Yes, but I think it is possible, and I think we have to aim for it, and pose that as a possibility. And I use the plural term, enlightenment's plural, because I don't believe that there's any one model of enlightenment that applies to everyone. That's why I'm against religious intolerance. You know, like my model is the only one, everyone should become an X or a Y. And as for the other point about we're Occidentals, we can't understand the Orient, I think if you look at things from the primordial perspective of Vedic philosophy, then we reincarnate between many lives and many cultures. And my great hero, Sir William Jones, became the chief judge in Calcutta when the British were running that part of India, and he learned Sanskrit. He was the first Westerner to learn Sanskrit and studied the Vedas. He was the first, British European intellectual to actually read and study the Vedas in Sanskrit. And he had an enlightened moment when he realised it was very similar to the Druid teachings of Wales, which he'd been brought up with. He was a Druid and a Welsh speaker. And he wrote a whole poem about the reconciliation of the Hindu gods with the Welsh Druid gods, and how that was part of why the British had been summoned to India by the gods themselves. I mean, I'd love to see that poem published. It's never really been published. I've just read about it. If a mission out there, we need to publish that poem.
thank you, yes.
Because it'd be fascinating. And that's an example of like somebody doing synthetic, intercultural, philosophical work through poetry, actually. And he coined the word Indo-European to describe this huge language family that, Sanskrit and Welsh and English and Norwegian were all part of. So, anyway, okay, now I want to move to the other one.
Can I just ask a question
Yeah,
before
yeah.
going? What would be the concrete steps towards complete and universal enlightenment? Like, how are we going to get started on a broad scale?
That's a good question. I mean, each tradition has its own teachings about that. In Buddhism, you sit and meditate at least sometimes during the day. You practice non-violence. You practice right speech, right motivation. The Eightfold Path is a pretty good way to start if you need it, as a formula. And in my commentary on the Gospel, I'm trying to explain that that's kind of exactly what Christ was teaching in different language, And I think all the sages of all of history have been teaching this. In Islam, it's there in the commentary on the Quran. There's wonderful passages in Islam where you don't expose the sins and faults of another person because God doesn't expose our sins and faults in public, So God covers our sins in order to bring us to a place of repentance and then transformation. So the journey to enlightenment is very long. We all fall down, we all make mistakes, and we all do sins, right? God wants us to get there and has sent all these prophets and teachers and their teachings. So I think study any of them. Aristotle is another great enlightened teacher, I think, who taught ethics and about moderation and so on. We've discussed that before. That's another great path. All these boxes are full of, brimful of strategies and remedies on the enlightenment path, in my opinion. But a great question. Okay, let's move to your one. You chose Jainism, and we're going to do number 89, Svetamvara. The founder, the historical recent founder of Jainism was called Mahavira, who lived around the same time as Buddha. But the Jains themselves believe that he was only the latest Tirthankara, which means a ford winner, a stream crosser. He found a way across the sufferings of the world to enlightenment.
I think I got lost. He mean the Buddha or
No,
the other-
Mahavira.
Okay.
We've gone to Jainism now.
Yeah.
But you might want to take the hood off just
No,
for
I
this.
heard, but you just were talking about Buddhism, so I thought, oh, is that what you meant then?
No, we're going on
I
to
can hear.
Mahavira. Okay. So he lived around that same time. And the Jains believe that he was only the most recent of these Tirthankaras. And they have a fabulously ancient, lengthy view of history and cosmology. When I've met the Jains in India many times, their mathematics is very, very extensive. And they believe there's always been on this planet a Tirthankara, who's laid down certain teachings. The most recent was this Mahavira, whose primary thing was to teach non-violence. He said the problem with this plane, this existence we're all in, is that people are too violent on every level. Emotional turbulence, passions, hatred, all that. But also verbally, we're abusive. I mean, if you could have a clairaudient ear and hear all the words on the planet right now, a lot of people having screaming fights, shouting at each other, swearing at each other, all that. He said, no, that's no good. That's antithetical to enlightenment. And then there's physical violence going on. People are fighting in the streets, drunk, or, crimes of passion. And then there are wars going on. He said all that's got to stop if we seriously want to get this planet enlightened, and individually. So he laid down teachings, like a code, a moral code. He said the spirit is eternal inside each of us. Our true self is not violent. We acquire negative karma by coming into this realm, and we pick it up like a kind of, a klesha, they're called, like a stain on our astral body. Okay, so we're actually pure spirit in incarnation, and the body's supposed to be a pure vehicle for us. But, we encounter people and we join gangs and we get in fights and, we pick up the kleshas that come with all that. And then the question is, how can we purify all that? If we turn onto the Jain path, or any path, you would say, Jain means victory. So the purpose of life is to become victorious over all the negativity and the evil that we see all around us. And he taught, quite strict rules on that. He was married. The role of Jain householders is sacred. You can have a pure marriage with your consort, loving purely. You don't commit sexual crimes, adultery and all that stuff. And I've met some amazing Jain family, people I've been invited to their houses to have supper, and they're such pure, radiant souls. They're very good at art. The Jains specialise in micro paintings. They do miniatures, like on something this big. They paint a whole fresco size cosmos. They do incredible art because they believe that beauty of all kinds, music, dance, painting, poetry, comes out of that pure state. And so there's a long lineage of Jain poets, and they're still going. What's incredible is they're still there in India. And the Svetamvara were the reformed lot. The purists don't wear any clothes at all. They're Digambaras, they're called, and they're the hardcore. But the Svetamvara in about the 1600s said, okay, we'll sometimes it's chilly in the winter, and so they allowed their disciples to wear white, which is a Druid colour. And so the ones I've met are the Svetamvaras. And the Acharya Tulsi, who was one of their leaders in the 20th century, a great sage, I met and had discussions and questions and answers with. So what happens after death, the Jains believe, is you're reincarnated till you've purified all your karma, till your greed and negativity is gone. And eventually you go to a particular part of the heaven worlds where you hook up with all the other enlightened sages. And they have like a map of the cosmos. And I went to a conference on Jainism and mathematics in Delhi, actually, and they were talking about the mathematics of this cosmology that they've got, which is traditional. And we were discussing, okay, so what has happened now? We've got new, more sophisticated telescopes, and we know how big the universe is. Where's heaven now? You know, because it used to be a sort of key-shaped diagram, and it was at the top of that. Where's that? You know, so there's some quite important Jain scientists. I've met a few of them trying to marry things like quantum physics with Jain philosophy, and they have this fundamental non-attachment to absolutism. Acharya Tulsi and the Jain sages teach what's called Anikant-vada, which means non-attachment. So, you know, when you look at the periodic table, if you say, well, that's my box, that's the one I believe in, and all the others are wrong, that would be to fail in the Jain eyes, because one has to suspend judgment. We don't absolutely know enough at the moment. Certainly I don't. I don't think who does on the planet to be able to say that this box or that box is absolutely right and all the other boxes are wrong. So Jainism says, therefore we have to be comfortable with not knowing. We have to suspend judgment. We can say, I mean, my position is I like a lot of these boxes, and you know there's truth in many of them, but I was once asked by a friend to rank them in order. He said, well, I like your table, but put them in a pyramid shape and put the best ones at the top. I refuse. I can't do that because they're all amazing and they've all arisen for historical reasons, right? And I think the Jains taught Piravellis to when he came to India the virtue of epoche, suspension of judgment, which then inspired Western academia. When I trained as a historian, you know, we're taught lesson 1, suspend judgment on the events of history and look into the facts, do the research. So that's why I get on with the Jains so much, because they're so much into peace and believe in wisdom. You know, it's a long journey that they've been on. I'm just, you know, been trying to help them with conferences they've been running. Dr. S.L. Gandhi. Acharya Tulsi was a teacher of the you know, other people who've worked in non-violence over the centuries. Oh, sorry, over the years. So it's an ongoing work. And there's a university, if anyone's interested in studying Jainism, please go to the university in Ladnan. You can do a master's degree in non-violence and Jain studies. And Jainism is taught in universities around. There's a good centre for Jain studies at SOAS at the University of London, where I did part of my degree, under Peter Flugel, who's a friend of mine, scholar of Jainism, and then in the States and elsewhere. And we had a big conference last year, which I helped organise on. Well, I've written the kind of declaration that we issued, and we're about to publish a book of the papers and things. So, yes, thank you. And there's about 500 million followers in the whole of history, probably, of the Svetamvara tradition. And now, you know, I estimated 4 million. It might be more than that, to be honest. I think it's probably more, but it's difficult doing the, you know, demographic numbers because it's not an exact science. And